represents.
Voting is often hailed as the cornerstone of democracy, a sacred right allowing citizens to shape the future of their nations. Yet in the 21st century, the very act of voting has become a battleground. Across the globe, efforts to expand or restrict access to the ballot box have ignited fierce political debates, pitting those fighting for increased participation against forces that seek to curtail it. In the United States, the battle over voting rights has intensified, with a focus on issues of race, class, and political power. Welcome to the War on Voting Rights. To fully understand the current landscape, we must first look back. The right to vote has been a central issue in American history for centuries. The civil rights movement of the 1960s was a turning point, with figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis leading the charge to secure voting rights for African Americans. This culminated in the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which sought to eliminate barriers such as literacy tests, poll taxes, and other tactics used to disenfranchise minority voters. The Voting Rights Act was a landmark achievement, and for decades it stood as a bulwark against voter suppression. However, the struggle didn't end there. In 2013, the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder weakened the Act's protections, effectively removing the requirement for certain states with a history of discrimination to receive federal approval before changing their voting laws. This opened the door to a new wave of restrictions, which proponents argue are meant to safeguard elections, but critics contend are designed to suppress turnout among minority and low-income voters. Since the Shelby decision, over 20 states have passed new voting restrictions, including voter ID laws, limits on early voting, and purging voter rolls. Supporters claim these measures protect against voter fraud, but evidence of widespread voter fraud remains scarce. Instead, these laws disproportionately affect marginalized communities, making it harder for them to exercise their right to vote. For example, strict voter ID laws can be burdensome for people who don't have easy access to identification, such as the elderly, students, and low-income citizens. In Texas, a concealed gun license is an acceptable form of ID, but a student ID is not. This kind of disparity raises questions about who these laws are truly targeting. Another tactic is voter roll purges, where states remove people from the registration list. While purges are sometimes necessary to maintain accurate records, some states have aggressively removed voters, often without notifying them. In Georgia, tens of thousands of voters were purged ahead of the 2018 gubernatorial election, disproportionately affecting African Americans. In response to these challenges, a wave of grassroots organizations, voting rights advocates, and legal groups have risen up to defend the right to vote. Figures like Stacey Abrams in Georgia have become national leaders in the fight to protect voting access using tactics like voter registration drives, legal challenges, and public awareness campaigns. Abrams' organization, Fair Fight, has focused on expanding access to the polls and combating voter suppression. Their work in Georgia helped mobilize record numbers of voters in the 2020 election, particularly among historically underrepresented groups. However, after that election, Georgia passed a sweeping new voting law that restricts access to absentee ballots, limits drop boxes, and even makes it a crime to give water to voters waiting in line. Critics have labelled these new laws Jim Crow 2.0, a reference to the era of racist laws designed to disenfranchise black voters. Georgia isn't alone. Across the US, similar measures have been introduced. In Texas, one of the most restrictive voting bills in recent memory was signed into law in 2021. It bans 24-hour voting, drive-through voting, and imposes new requirements for mail-in ballots. These methods were popularized during the pandemic, making it easier for people, especially those in urban and minority communities, to vote. Now, those options are severely restricted. At the heart of the debate is the question: who benefits from these voting restrictions? Political scientists argue that the answer lies in partisan advantage. In many cases, the groups most affected by voting restrictions tend to lean toward the Democratic Party. Republicans, who control many of the states enacting these laws, often defend them as necessary to prevent fraud and maintain election integrity. Yet, critics argue that these laws are part of a broader strategy to weaken the influence of minority and young voters, who typically vote Democrat. The war on voting rights is also tied to gerrymandering, a practice where political districts are drawn in ways that benefit one party over another. By strategically drawing district lines, politicians can minimize the impact of opposition voters, effectively diluting their power. Gerrymandering, coupled with voting restrictions, creates a system where the voice of the electorate is not fully represented. The fight for voting rights isn't confined to the United States. Around the world, authoritarian regimes have used similar tactics to suppress opposition and retain power. In places like Russia, Venezuela, and Belarus, leaders manipulate election systems, limit opposition participation, and use state resources to maintain their hold on power. The global struggle for voting rights highlights the fragility of democracy and the importance of vigilance in protecting it. But there's hope. The For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act are two pieces of federal legislation that aim to restore and expand voting protections in the US. These bills would combat gerrymandering, restore federal oversight of voting laws, and make it easier for people to vote by expanding early voting, vote by mail options, and same-day registration. The war on voting rights is far from over. As new laws are passed, advocates continue to fight in courtrooms, in state legislatures, and at the ballot box. The right to vote is not guaranteed. It must be protected, fought for, and expanded to ensure that every citizen has a voice in shaping the future of their nation. In the words of the late John Lewis, a civil rights icon and long-time advocate for voting rights, the vote is precious. It is almost sacred. It is the most powerful non-violent tool we have in a democratic society, and we must use it. The war on voting rights is not just a legal or political struggle, it's a moral one. The future of democracy depends on it. For more documentaries like this, please follow us at Red Blue Digest on all platforms.